The Navy SEALs laughed when they saw her. 17 years old, maybe 100 pounds, soaking wet, wearing an oversized white parka that made her look even smaller against the towering Montana pines. She carried a rifle that looked older than she was, a British L-96 with a worn wooden stock and scope that had seen better decades. "You lost, sweetheart," Petty Officer Jake Merrick called out, his breath fogging in the frozen air. "Need us to call your parents?" The girl stopped 20 meters from their defensive perimeter. Snow clung to her dark hair, which hung in a braid over one shoulder. Her face was wind-burned and dirt-streaked. She looked like she'd been living rough for days. Probably some hiker who'd gotten separated from a group wandered into the wrong valley at the wrong time. "Ma'am, this is a military operation," Lieutenant Garrett Thorne announced, his voice carrying authority across the clearing. "You need to leave this area immediately. It's not safe." The girl tilted her head slightly, studying them with unsettling calm. Her eyes were older than her face, much older. When she spoke, her voice cut through the wind like a blade through silk. "You have about 2 minutes before 30 militia fighters pin you in that valley. Your extraction point is compromised." The SEALs exchanged glances. Staff Sergeant Reese Dalton actually laughed, a short, disbelieving bark that echoed off the rocks. Thorne raised his hand for silence. Something about the girl's tone bothered him. Too confident, too specific. He'd been leading SEAL teams for 15 years, long enough to know when someone was bluffing and when they genuinely knew something he didn't. "How do you know about militia?" he asked, bringing his rifle to low ready, but not quite pointing it at her. The girl shifted the L-96 on her shoulder. The movement was practiced, economical, not the fumbling grip of a civilian who'd found Daddy's hunting rifle. "Because they murdered 43 people from my commune 6 days ago," she said flatly. "I've been tracking them ever since." She reached slowly into her parka. The SEALs tensed and withdrew a folded piece of paper. Synthetic fabric, waterproof. She held it up, then laid it on a flat rock and stepped back. Petty Officer Brandon Locke moved forward, cautiously retrieved the paper, unfolded it. His eyebrows rose. "Sir, you need to see this." Thorne took the paper. It was a hand-drawn tactical map rendered with surprising precision. Topographical features marked accurately. Grid coordinates noted in neat handwriting, and overlaid on the terrain red circles indicating enemy positions, patrol routes shown with dotted arrows, numbers denoting force estimates. Supply caches, communication posts, rally points. This wasn't the doodle of a scared teenager. This was professional-grade intelligence. "Where did you get this?" Thorne demanded. "I made it." The girl's voice carried no pride, just statement of fact. "Watching them, learning their patterns. They killed my father defending our home. I've had 6 days to memorize everything about them." She pointed north without looking, her hand steady. 3 squads, one positioned on the ridge overlooking your approach, one in the tree line to your east, one mobile sweeping from the south. They're converging. You walked into their territory and they've been shadowing you since you crossed Boulder Creek. Thorne felt ice that had nothing to do with temperature settle in his gut. Boulder Creek was 4 kilometers back. "Why should we believe you?" For the first time, something flickered across the girl's face. Not anger. Exhaustion mixed with something harder. Something that had been carved into her by fire and blood. "Because in 90 seconds you're going to detect movement on your 6 o'clock, and then you can decide whether the crazy hiker was right." She turned to walk away. "Wait!" Thorne called. But the girl kept moving, becoming a pale ghost against the white forest. 80 seconds later, Petty Officer Devon Stryker's voice crackled over the tactical net. "Movement, multiple contacts, eastern approach, at least a dozen." The firing started 30 seconds after that. The ambush was textbook. 3-sided envelopment, heavy weapons positioned on high ground, escape routes blocked by geography. The Scorpion militia might be domestic extremists, but someone had trained them properly. Their fire discipline was solid, their tactical movement coordinated. Chief Petty Officer James Kavanaugh dragged Locke behind cover as 7.62 rounds chewed bark from the trees where they'd been standing. Locke was bleeding from a graze across his thigh, not life-threatening but enough to slow him down. "Contact front!" Marcus Wilde shouted, his rifle barking in controlled bursts. "Contact left. Ammunition check." Thorne ordered, his mind racing through options that were all bad. They'd planned for a quick extraction, not a sustained firefight. Light loadout, minimal supplies, and now they were pinned in a depression with enemy forces on 3 sides and the 4th side dropping into a ravine that would break legs even if you survived the fall. 60%, Dalton called back. "Maybe less." Not enough. Not nearly enough. The militia had positioned a belt-fed machine gun on the eastern ridge. Its distinctive hammering roar joined the symphony of gunfire. Rounds slammed into their position, kicking up snow and frozen earth. "We need to break contact," Kavanaugh shouted over the noise. "Locke can't sustain a running fight." Thorne knew he was right, but break contact to where the terrain boxed them in. The militia held the high ground. This position was rapidly transforming from defensible to indefensible to untenable. They had maybe 4 minutes before those belt-fed rounds found flesh instead of pine. Then, as suddenly as a switch being flipped, the machine gun went silent. Thorne risked a glance toward the ridge. Through his scope, he saw the gunner slumped over his weapon, still. Very still. A militia fighter moved to take over the gun, dropped mid-stride. Another moved up from cover, fell back into it permanently. The shots were coming from somewhere northwest outside the ambush perimeter. Single rounds, precisely spaced. Each one found its target with mechanical efficiency. Thorne understood with the sudden clarity of combat revelation. The girl, a 4th militia fighter on the ridge, tried to flank to better cover, made it 3 steps before pitching forward into the snow. The distinctive crack of a British L-96 echoed across the valley a half-second after impact, the sound lagging behind the supersonic bullet. "Someone's on our side." Wilde breathed, his eyes still pressed to his scope. "Northwest, elevated position, range." He paused, calculating windage and bullet drop. 600 meters, maybe more. 600 meters in this wind, with visibility reduced by swirling snow. Thorne had trained with some of the best military marksmen in the world. Shots like that separated championship competitors from weekend hobbyists. The girl's voice crackled over the militia's radio frequency. She must have taken one from a body. "American unit, move now while they're confused." Thorne made the decision in the space between heartbeats. Tactical protocol said never trust unidentified third parties in a combat zone. But tactical protocol also said don't stay in a kill box when someone offers you an exit. Move out while Dalton carry Locke. Everyone else bounding overwatch. Go. The team moved with the fluid coordination of operators who'd trained together until movement became muscle memory. They bounded from cover to cover, each seal covering the next man's movement. Locke bit back curses as Wilde and Dalton hauled him between them. Behind them, the militia position descended into chaos. Their command structure was decapitated, their heavy weapons silenced. Confusion rippled through their ranks as invisible death picked them off whenever they tried to reorganize. The SEALs crashed into the tree line and kept moving. Thorne counted seconds, measured distance, calculated pursuit probability. When they'd put 300 meters between themselves and the ambush site, he called a halt in a small depression surrounded by fallen timber. "Security perimeter. Wild Merrick, watch our back trail. Kavanaugh, check Locke's wound." The team settled into position, weapons trained outward, breathing hard. The forest had gone quiet except for the wind through the pines and the distant echo of sporadic gunfire as the militia fired at shadows. Thorne pulled out his tactical map, spread it on a flat rock. They were 4 kilometers from the extraction point, with unknown enemy forces between them and safety. Locke was mobile but compromised. Communications were still jammed, some kind of localized interference that was playing hell with their satellite uplink. The snow crunched behind him. Every SEAL's weapon swiveled toward the sound. The girl emerged from the white forest like a materialization. One second the trees were empty, the next she was there, her white parka making her almost invisible until she moved. She carried the L-96 with professional ease, finger outside the trigger guard barrel, pointed safely down. Up close, Thorne revised his age estimate. Maybe 17, maybe younger. Her face had that unfinished quality of late adolescence, but her eyes belonged to someone who'd seen things that most people spent their entire lives avoiding. "You move quietly," Dalton observed, his rifle still trained on her center mass. "These mountains don't forgive noise," she replied. "Sound carries, especially when it's this cold." Thorne stepped forward, putting himself between his team and the stranger. "You saved our lives. Thank you. But I need to know who you are and how you learned to shoot like that." The girl studied him for a moment, weighing something internal. Then she spoke, her voice carrying the careful pronunciation of someone who'd learned to enunciate clearly. "My name is Ember Blackwood, 17 years old. I've lived in the Bitterroot Mountains my entire life. My grandfather was British SAS, served in Burma during World War II, immigrated to Montana in 1975. He taught my father everything he knew. My father was Army Rangers, 75th Regiment, 3 tours. He taught me." She paused and something raw flickered across her face before she locked it down again. "6 days ago, the Scorpion militia attacked our commune at dawn. 43 people. They wanted our land, about 200 acres of valley and timber rights. We refused to leave, so they killed everyone to send a message to other off-grid communities." The SEALs were silent. Even in the Montana wilderness, 43 murders made headlines. Thorne hadn't heard about it because his team had been wheels up for this mission when it happened, operating in the communications blackout that characterized special operations. "My father held them off long enough for me to escape into the high country," Ember continued, her voice steady but her hands tightening on her rifle. "I heard him die over our radio. He told me to run, to survive, to remember everything Papa taught me." "I'm sorry for your loss," Thorne said, and meant it. He'd delivered too many death notifications in his career, seen too many families destroyed by violence. "But why help us? You could have stayed hidden." Ember looked at him with those ancient eyes. "Because you're witnesses. You have authority. People will listen to you. I need the world to know what happened here, what these men did." She shifted her grip on the rifle. "And because they're tracking you to kill you. I've spent 6 days watching them hunt. I know their patterns. I can get you to safety." "The extraction point is compromised," Ember interrupted. "They know about the old ranger station. It's the only flat ground for a helicopter within 10 kilometers. They've had people watching it since yesterday." She knelt by Thorne's map, her finger tracing a route that diverged from their planned egress. "But there's another way, through the deadfall zone to an old mining complex, mostly collapsed, but one building is still solid, defensible. Multiple escape routes if you need them. And there's a clearing 300 meters beyond where your helicopter can land." Dalton leaned in, studying the route. His expression was skeptical. "Deadfall zone in winter? That's suicide. Unstable snow, hidden crevasses, avalanche risk." "Not if you know the safe paths," Ember said. "I do. I've crossed it dozens of times." Thorne weighed the options with the cold calculus that kept operators alive. Trust the teenage civilian with no credentials beyond her word, or stick to the planned extraction point that was apparently under enemy observation? Some choice, but she'd already proven herself. 4 shots, 4 kills at ranges that required genuine expertise, and her map was better than the satellite imagery his mission planners had provided. "Locke," he called. "How's the leg?" Locke grimaced. "I can walk. Not sprint, but I can walk." "How far to this mining complex?" Thorne asked Ember. 2 kilometers. Maybe 90 minutes at combat pace with an injured man." Thorne made the call. "We follow your lead, but tactical decisions run through me. Understood?" Ember nodded once. "Fair enough. Let's move." She stood, shouldered her rifle, and began walking. After a moment's hesitation, the SEALs followed. The terrain was worse than brutal. It was malevolent. What Ember called the deadfall zone was a labyrinth of fallen timber from an avalanche or windstorm years past. Massive pines lay crisscrossed like giants' pickup sticks, buried under snow that concealed gaps and drops in treacherous footing. The temperature was dropping as afternoon waned toward evening, and with it came that particular cold that turned sweat into ice and made breathing feel like inhaling knives. Ember moved through it like water flowing downhill. She never hesitated, never backtracked. Her path wound between obstacles with the confidence of absolute familiarity. Step here, not there. Duck under this log, climb over that one. The seemingly random route was actually perfectly calculated for safety and efficiency. The SEALs struggled to keep up. Dalton, carrying Locke's pack in addition to his own, stumbled over a hidden branch. Ember's hand shot out, caught his arm, steadied him. She didn't say anything, just redirected him 3 feet left where the footing was solid. How does she know where to step? Stryker muttered, his voice tight with the effort of keeping pace. She lives here, Locke answered through gritted teeth, pain making his words clipped. We're just visiting. They'd been moving for 40 minutes when Ember held up a closed fist, the universal military signal for halt. The SEALs froze instantly, weapons coming up, scanning for threats. Ember pointed left, then made a circling motion. Thorne low-crawled up beside her. What is it? Crevasse. 8 feet deep, 10 feet across. Snow bridge makes it invisible. Path goes around. She pointed to a route that seemed to go directly away from their objective. Adds 5 minutes, but keeps us alive. Thorne nodded. They took the detour. 15 minutes later, they heard shouting behind them. Militia fighters pursuing through the deadfall. One scream cut off abruptly, followed by crashing sounds and more yelling. Someone found the crevasse, Ember said quietly. The hard way. They kept moving. The mining complex materialized from the forest like something from a ghost story. Half-collapsed buildings rotted slowly into the earth. Rusted equipment lay scattered like the bones of industrial dinosaurs. But one structure remained mostly intact, a storage building with 3 walls and most of a roof built from stone and heavy timber that had weathered decades of mountain winters. Ember led them inside. The interior was dim but sheltered from the wind. It smelled of old wood and stone and the peculiar absence of scent that go with long abandonment. Secure the perimeter, Thorne ordered. His team moved automatically, taking up defensive positions covering the approaches. Kavanaugh went to work on Locke's leg wound, redressing it with fresh field dressings. Thorne found Ember at the back of the building, checking something behind a pile of old mining equipment. She straightened, carrying a waterproof pack. Supply cache, she explained. My father and I scouted this location 6 months ago. Emergency fallback if the commune ever needed it. She opened the pack. Inside, military MREs, water purification tablets, a first aid kit, and 4 boxes of rifle ammunition. Your father was a smart man, Thorne said. He was the best man. Ember corrected, her voice carrying an edge like broken glass. And they killed him. She turned away before Thorne could respond, moving to a gap in the wall that offered a view of their back trail. She settled into a shooter's position with the ease of long practice, scanning through her rifle scope. Thorne joined Dalton at the front of the building. What do you think? Dalton asked quietly. I think she's kept us alive so far, and I think we'd be dead if we'd gone to the original extraction point. She's 17 years old. So were we once. Old enough to enlist, old enough to fight. Thorne paused. Old enough to survive when everyone around you dies. Dalton grimaced but didn't argue. They'd both seen what war did to people. Age was just a number. Trauma was universal. Kavanaugh approached, medical kit in hand. Locke's stable, but he's running a low fever. Wounds clean, but I'm worried about infection. We need to get him to proper medical within 24 hours. Communication's still down. Still jammed. Whatever's doing it has serious range and power. Thorne pulled out his map again, studying the terrain. They were off-grid, out of contact with an injured operator and unknown enemy forces hunting them. The next extraction window was 18 hours away, assuming the extraction team could even reach them without communications. Wild's voice carried from his position. Movement, northeast quadrant, 500 meters. Everyone's weapons swiveled toward the threat. Through the gaps in the walls, Thorne could see figures moving through the forest. Not militia fighters stumbling around in the snow. These moved with military precision, spacing, and formation discipline that spoke of professional training. Ember appeared beside him, studying the approaching force through her rifle scope. Her face went pale. "Russians," she said quietly. "PMC contractors, 12 of them led by a man named Viktor Sokolov. Former Spetsnaz, they've been training the Scorpion militia for 6 months." "How do you know this?" She pulled a small digital camera from her parka, clicked through images, showed Thorne surveillance photos, distant but clear, of military-age males in tactical gear carrying professional-grade weapons. Not the mixture of hunting rifles and AR-15s that the militia used. These were carrying AK-103s, SVD rifles, RPGs. "I've been watching them, photographing everything, learning." She zoomed in on one photo, a Russian operator carrying a boxy device with a distinctive antenna array. "That's portable thermal imaging. Russian military surplus. In this weather, in this terrain, will light up like beacons." Thorne felt the tactical situation collapse. How effective! Sees through snow, through fog, through tree cover. Detects body heat at 800 meters. Ember's voice was flat. "Our white camo, our terrain advantage, our concealment, all useless. They'll track us like we're on fire." She clicked to another photo. A tall man with a scarred face, perhaps 40 years old, built like a heavyweight boxer. "That's Sokolov. He led the attack on my commune. I watched him shoot our leader when he refused to leave our land." The hatred in her voice was cold and controlled. The kind of hatred that didn't explode in rage, but instead compressed into diamond-hard determination. "These Russians," Thorne said slowly. "How dangerous are they? More dangerous than the militia. They're professionals. They know what they're doing." Ember lowered the camera. "The militia's angry amateurs with guns. The Russians are soldiers. There's a difference." Thorne knew she was right. The tactical picture was getting worse by the hour. Not just fighting local extremists, now they were up against foreign military contractors with professional training and equipment. "Can we defend this position?" he asked. Ember studied the mining complex with a professional eye that seemed far older than her years. "Against the militia? Yes. Against the Russians with thermal imaging." She paused. "Maybe, for a while. But once they get that imager close enough to scan us, we lose every advantage. Then we need to slow them down, buy time until we can establish communications and call for extraction." "How?" Thorne looked at her. At this 17-year-old girl who'd survived genocide and spent 6 days alone in winter mountains tracking the men who'd murdered her family. Who'd saved 9 Navy SEALs with 4 impossible shots and was now calmly discussing defensive tactics like she'd done it 100 times before. "You're the expert on this terrain," he said. "What would you recommend?" Ember thought for a moment, her eyes distant. Then she pulled out her hand-drawn map and pointed to a location 400 meters from their current position. "There's an old mine shaft, one of the first digs from the 1920s, structurally unstable cave-in waiting to happen. If it collapsed, the avalanche would block the main approach route. They'd have to go around, adds at least 2 hours to their movement, and it would destroy their thermal imager if they're anywhere near it." "How do we collapse it?" "Explosive charges at the support beams. Doesn't take much, the whole thing is ready to come down." "We don't have demolitions with us." Ember shook her head. "But my father's cache does. Old dynamite from the mining days, dangerous stuff, nitroglycerin sweating after 60 years. But it'll work if we're careful." Thorne felt the weight of command settle on his shoulders. The plan made tactical sense. Slow the enemy, buy time, improve their position. But it required someone to infiltrate past Russian forces, set charges in an unstable mine, and get out before the whole thing came down. "I'll send Saunders," he said. "He's trained for demolitions." "He doesn't know the terrain," Ember countered. "In darkness, in this weather. He'll be lost in 30 seconds and the Russians will hear him stumbling around. Or worse, they'll pick him up on thermal before he gets halfway there. So you can guide him." "I can do it myself." Ember's voice was flat, brooking no argument. "I've walked these mountains blind. I know every rock, every tree. I know how to move so thermal can't pick me up, stay in dead ground, use terrain masking, move during wind gusts when heat signatures blur. This is what I do now. This is who I am." "You're 17 years old. And I'm the only one who can do this." She met his eyes. "Lieutenant, I've been on my own in hostile territory for 6 days. I've infiltrated close enough to photograph Russians without them knowing. This is what I do now. This is who I am." Thorne wanted to argue. Every instinct screamed against sending a civilian teenager on a combat mission. But those same instincts were also telling him she was right. The Russians owned the terrain now. A SEAL moving through unfamiliar ground would be detected. Ember had home field advantage and the fieldcraft to use it. "If I don't come back," Ember said quietly, "tell people what happened here. Tell them about my father, about the 43 people from the commune. Make them remembered, not just names in a report, real people who died defending their home." Thorne held her gaze, saw the determination there, and beneath it the ocean of grief she was holding back through sheer force of will. "You're coming back," he said. "That's an order." Ember's mouth twitched in something that might have been a smile in another context. "You don't outrank me, Lieutenant. I'm not one of yours." She checked her rifle one last time, loaded a fresh magazine, secured her knife. Then she looked at the gathered SEALs, these professional warriors who'd spent the last hours following her lead through impossible terrain. "Thank you for listening," she said. "Most people don't. Not to someone my age." "You've earned it," Wilde said simply. Ember nodded once. Then she pulled her white parka's hood up and moved toward the gap in the wall. 2 hours, she said over her shoulder. "When you hear the explosion, be ready to move. The Russians will be confused. That's when we make for the backup extraction point." She slipped through the gap and disappeared into the gathering darkness. The SEALs watched her go, this ghost girl in white who'd somehow become their guide, their guardian, their best hope for survival. "Sir," Dalton said quietly, "that kid's got more guts than most operators I've known." Thorne didn't answer. He was too busy watching the forest where Ember had vanished and silently counting down the seconds until she'd either come back or die alone in the mountains that had claimed everyone she loved. The wind picked up, carrying snow and the distant sound of Russian voices calling orders in a language none of them spoke. And in the darkness beyond their refuge, a 17-year-old girl with her grandfather's rifle and her father's determination moved through terrain that would kill anyone who didn't know its secrets, carrying enough unstable explosive to bring down a mountain and buy them the time they needed to survive. If she survived. The clock was ticking. The darkness was absolute. Ember moved through it like smoke, her white parka blending with the snow-covered landscape until she became part of the mountain itself. The temperature had dropped to 20 below. Each breath crystallized, instantly forming ice on the inside of her hood. She'd learned years ago to breathe through cloth to minimize the vapor clouds that gave away position in cold weather operations. Her grandfather had taught her father the technique in the mountains of Burma. Her father had taught her in these very mountains. Now she used it to stay invisible from the Russians who occupied her home. The terrain spoke to her in ways it never would to outsiders. The particular crunch of snow over stable ground versus the hollow sound that meant hidden ice. The shape of drifts that indicated wind patterns and safe passage. The shadows that marked depressions deep enough to hide a body or expose an ankle to breaking cold. She moved with absolute confidence through zero visibility, her body remembering what her eyes couldn't see. The Russian patrol passed 30 meters to her left, 4 men in thermal gear carrying modern weapons with infrared scopes. Professional spacing, proper tactical formation. They were hunting for the Americans, sweeping the forest with the patience of experienced operators who knew rushing led to mistakes. Ember pressed herself flat against a boulder, controlling her breathing, until her heart rate dropped to something barely above rest. Slow metabolism, minimal heat signature. Another lesson from Papa, refined through a childhood spent hunting elk in winter, when the cold could kill as surely as any predator. The Russians spoke in low voices. She understood fragments. Her grandfather had insisted she learn 3 languages, and Russian was one of them. They were discussing search patterns, complaining about the cold, speculating about the American force size. They had no idea she existed. To them, she was just another shadow in a forest full of shadows. When they passed, she waited a full 3 minutes. Then she moved again. The mine shaft entrance was exactly where memory placed it. A dark mouth in the hillside, partially concealed by 70 years of overgrowth and snowdrift. The timber supports were original hand-hewn logs from the 1920s when miners had thought these mountains would make them rich. Instead, the gold had run out fast and the mine had been abandoned, left to slowly collapse as weather and time did their work. Ember slipped inside, pulling a small red-filtered flashlight from her pocket. Red light preserved night vision while still illuminating the immediate area. The beam revealed her father's cache exactly where he'd hidden it 6 months ago when they'd scouted escape routes together. Before the world ended. Before she'd lost everything except the skills he'd spent 17 years teaching her. The dynamite was in a weatherproof case surrounded by desiccant packets to absorb moisture. 6 sticks old enough to be dangerous, stable enough to be useful if handled with proper respect. Each stick had nitroglycerin beading on the surface, the sign of age that made experienced demolition experts nervous and amateurs dead. She'd watched her father handle explosives dozens of times, had helped him clear dangerous deadfall with carefully placed charges. He'd taught her the theory, made her recite the safety protocols, insisted she understand the chemistry before she ever touched the materials. Now she lifted the first stick with hands steady as stone, her breathing controlled, her movements deliberate. The support beams were obvious targets, 4 massive logs that held up the entire entrance structure. Take out the beams, the mountain did the rest. She placed the first charge against the northern support using tape from her pack to secure it, checked it twice, moved to the second beam. The voice came from behind her, speaking English with a thick Russian accent. "So, the little ghost shows herself." Ember's hand froze halfway to her knife. She turned slowly, keeping her movements non-threatening. Viktor Sokolov stood 10 feet away, an AK-103 held casually but expertly in his hands. His face was hard angles and old scars, the map of a man who'd survived combat in places most people couldn't pronounce. His eyes held the particular flatness of someone who'd killed enough times that it had stopped meaning anything beyond tactical necessity. "I have been watching you," he continued, stepping closer. "For days, always at distance, always just out of reach. You move like Spetsnaz. You shoot like champion. Very impressive for one so young." Ember said nothing. Her mind raced through options. The knife was too far. Her rifle was slung across her back. The dynamite was live and unstable. One stray round could detonate it and bring the whole mine down on both of them. "Who trained you?" Sokolov asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. "Not American military. They do not teach this level of fieldcraft to civilians." "My grandfather was British SAS," Ember said quietly. Her voice echoed slightly in the confined space. "He taught my father. My father taught me." Sokolov's eyebrows rose. "Ah, the British one. I read reports of your commune. Former ranger, yes. Killed 5 of my militia before we brought him down. He fought well." Something cold and bright flashed through Ember's chest. Not rage. Rage was hot and made you stupid. This was something colder, harder. The feeling of absolute certainty about what needed to happen next. "You were there," she said, not a question. "I led attack personally. Your people refused to leave land. This created problem. Problems require solutions." He shrugged, the gesture almost apologetic. "Is not personal. Is business. Militia pays well for training, for planning. Your commune was in way of their territorial expansion. You killed 43 people for business. I have killed many more for many reasons. This is what soldiers do." Sokolov studied her with something that might have been professional respect. "But you survived. You tracked us. You killed 4 of my militia. You saved American soldiers. Very impressive." He shifted the rifle slightly, the barrel still not quite pointing at her, but ready to shift in an instant. "I make you offer. Come work for me. I train you properly, make you real operator, not just mountain girl with rifle. Good money. See world. Use your skills professionally." Ember met his eyes, saw no malice there, only pragmatic calculation. To him, this was just a job offer. The fact that he'd murdered her family was irrelevant business already concluded. "I'd rather die," she said. Sokolov's face hardened. "Then you are fool." His hand moved toward the rifle's pistol grip. Ember's hand was already moving faster. The knife left her belt in a practice draw her father had drilled into her 10,000 times. The throw was pure muscle memory, distance calculated automatically, rotation speed adjusted for the confined space, release point perfect. The blade sank into Sokolov's shoulder just below the clavicle, angled down toward his lung. He roared, stumbling backward, his finger jerking on the trigger. The rifle's muzzle flash was blinding in the confined space. The round went wide, sparking off stone 6 inches from Ember's head. She was already running. Behind her, Sokolov's curses echoed in Russian and broken English. He tried to pursue, but the knife wound had damaged something important. His breathing was labored, bloody. Ember sprinted through the mine tunnels, her red light bouncing crazily off the walls. The layout was burned into her memory from months of exploration. Left at the first junction, right at the second. Through the narrow passage that required turning sideways. Into the escape tunnel her father had insisted they memorize. Sokolov was still coming, his breathing ragged and wet, but he didn't know the mine. He was operating blind in unfamiliar terrain with a punctured lung. The odds had shifted. Ember reached the escape tunnel's exit, a crack in the rock face barely wide enough for a teenager. She squeezed through her parka, catching on stone fabric tearing. Behind her, she heard Sokolov reach the crack and try to follow. He was too big, too broad across the shoulders. He pushed and cursed and realized he was trapped. Then his voice changed. Recognition. Horror. He'd seen the dynamite charges, understood what they meant, understood he was standing inside a bomb with a timer counting down. Ember emerged into the winter night and ran. Her lungs burned, her legs screamed. She ran anyway, counting seconds in her head. At 2 minutes remaining, she dove behind a granite boulder and pressed herself flat. The explosion was catastrophic. Not just the dynamite that would have been impressive enough, but the dynamite had destabilized the support beams, and the beams had been holding back 70 years of accumulated geological pressure. The entire mine entrance collapsed with a roar like artillery fire. Thousands of tons of rock and earth rushed into the void, the avalanche extending far beyond the original shaft. The shockwave hit Ember's boulder like a physical blow. Dust and debris rained down, trees cracked and fell. The mountain itself seemed to shudder and resettle. Then silence. Ember lay gasping, her ears ringing, her body shaking with adrenaline crash. She'd survived. Somehow, impossibly, she'd survived again. But the cost. She thought about Sokolov trapped in the mine, wondered if the explosion had killed him instantly or if he'd had time to know what was coming. Part of her hoped he'd had time, hoped he'd felt what her family had felt in those final moments. The rest of her felt nothing at all, just hollow, empty, like something vital had been carved out and left bleeding. She forced herself to stand, to move. The mission wasn't over. The SEALs were waiting. She'd promised to come back. Ember stumbled into the mining complex 40 minutes later. The SEALs had their weapons trained on the entrance until they recognized her white parka, now torn and filthy, covered in rock dust and her own blood from a dozen small cuts. Lieutenant Thorne met her at the entrance, his face tight with controlled concern. "You're hurt." "I'm alive." Ember's voice was hoarse from breathing dust and cold. "The mine's collapsed. Western approach is blocked. They'll have to detour at least 3 kilometers to get around, and their thermal imager is buried under a mountain." "We heard the explosion. Thought..." Thorne stopped himself. "Thought I was dead." Ember almost smiled. "So did I for a second." Kavanaugh approached with his medical kit. "Let me check those cuts." "Later. We need to." Ember swayed on her feet. The adrenaline was finally running out, leaving only exhaustion and the bone-deep cold that came from spending hours in sub-zero weather while running on 6 days of minimal food and no sleep. Strong hands caught her, Wild and Dalton supporting her weight. "Easy," Wild said quietly. "You did good. Now let us take care of you for a minute." Ember wanted to argue, but her body wouldn't cooperate. They lowered her to a sitting position against the stone wall. Kavanaugh worked efficiently, cleaning cuts, checking for serious injury, forcing her to drink water and eat an energy bar. The food tasted like cardboard and chemicals, but her body desperately needed the calories. She chewed mechanically, her mind replaying the mine shaft confrontation. Sokolov's face, the knife throw, the explosion. How many people had she killed now? 4 militia during the initial ambush. Sokolov in the mine, maybe others caught in the avalanche. She'd lost count. The numbers had stopped meaning anything except survival versus death. Ember. Thorne's voice pulled her back to present. What happened in there? She told them. Sokolov's ambush, the conversation, the fight, the escape. Her voice was flat, reciting facts without emotion because emotion was a luxury she couldn't afford. When she finished, the SEALs were silent. You fought the Russian commander hand to hand, Merrick said slowly, and won. I got lucky. He was talking when he should have been shooting. Luck is when preparation meets opportunity, Thorne quoted. Your father trained you well. Something in Ember's chest twisted at the mention of her father. She pushed it down. Later. She could break down later. Now she needed to stay functional. We need to move soon, she said, forcing herself to focus. The avalanche bought us time, but not enough. They'll regroup, find another route. We should be gone before they figure out where we are. Communications are still jammed, Stryker reported. Whatever's blocking us has serious range. Ember frowned, thinking. The Russians have a command post, about 8 kilometers northeast. I saw it 3 days ago when I was tracking their supply routes. Big antenna array generator trucks. That's probably your jammer source. 8 kilometers through hostile territory, Dalton said, with Locke injured and no support. There's another way. Ember pulled out her map, her hands steadier now that food and water were hitting her system. The backup extraction point I mentioned. It's only 2 kilometers from here. Small clearing, just big enough for 1 helicopter, but the approach is treacherous. They won't expect us to use it because it's too dangerous. Why is it dangerous? Thorne asked. Avalanche zone. The slope above it is loaded with unstable snow. Any loud noise could trigger a slide that would bury anything in the clearing. She pointed to the topographical lines. But if we're careful, if we move quietly, we can reach it, call for extraction, and be gone before they find us. Wild was studying the map with his sniper's eye for terrain. That's threading a needle. 1 wrong move and we're buried. Yes, Ember agreed. But threading needles is better than standing still while they bring up mortars. Thorne considered the options, all of them bad. None of them good, but some less fatal than others. How long until your jammer theory can be tested? If communications work at the clearing, we'll know I was right about the range. If they don't... Ember shrugged. Then we're no worse off than we are now. Sir, Locke called from his position. His face was pale, fever bright. I vote for the plan that gets us to a hospital faster. That decided it. We move in 30 minutes, Thorne ordered. Minimum necessary gear. Everything else we cache here in case we need to come back. Stryker Merrick rigged some surprises for anyone who follows us. The team moved into action with practiced efficiency. Stryker and Merrick set up simple but effective deterrents, tripwires connected to flashbang grenades, loose stones positioned to cascade noisily and give warning of pursuit. Nothing lethal, but enough to slow down hunters and make them cautious. Ember sat against the wall, forcing herself to rest while she could. Her body was shutting down, demanding sleep she couldn't give it. 6 days of constant movement and stress were catching up. She'd been running on fear and adrenaline and sheer bloody-minded determination to make her family's deaths mean something. Now, with the mine collapsed and Sokolov dead, she felt hollow. Empty, like she'd poured out everything she had and there was nothing left to sustain her. Kavanaugh crouched beside her with another energy bar and a water bottle. Eat, drink, that's an order. You can't order me. I'm not military. Then consider it strong medical advice from someone who's seen what happens to people who push themselves past breaking. His voice was gentle but firm. You've been running on empty for days. Your body is going to crash hard when this is over. We need you functional for a few more hours. Ember took the food chewed without tasting. What if I don't want to be functional anymore? What if I just want to stop? Kavanaugh was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen similar darkness. I've been where you are. Different war, different circumstances, but that feeling of being hollowed out, of wondering what the point is when everyone you loved is gone. He met her eyes. The point is that you're still here, still breathing, still able to make sure their deaths weren't meaningless. I killed him, Ember said quietly. Sokolov. I stabbed him and left him to die in that mine, and I don't feel anything about it. Shouldn't I feel something? Maybe not right now. Maybe not for a long time. Trauma does strange things to our emotional responses. Kavanaugh placed a hand on her shoulder. But you did what you had to do. You survived. Your father told you to survive. You're honoring him by doing exactly that. Ember nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The food was helping, restoring some small measure of strength. Enough to stand. Enough to keep moving. Enough to finish what she'd started. Thorne gathered the team for final brief. 2 kilometers to extraction point. Terrain is hostile, but we have the best possible guide. We move quietly, we move carefully, we survive. Questions? No one spoke. Ember. Thorne turned to her. You lead. We follow. Get us there safely. She stood, shouldered her rifle, checked that her knife was secure in its sheath. The blade was gone, buried in Sokolov's shoulder in the collapsed mine. But she had others. Her father had taught her to always carry backups. Stay in my footsteps exactly, she told them. Don't deviate. The avalanche zone doesn't forgive mistakes. She moved to the entrance, paused, looked back at these 9 professional warriors who'd learned to trust a 17-year-old girl because she'd proven herself the only way that mattered by keeping them alive when everyone else wanted them dead. Thank you, she said quietly, for listening to me, for treating me like I know what I'm talking about. Most adults don't do that. Most adults haven't earned it the way you have, Wilde replied. Ember nodded once. Then she stepped into the night and the seals followed. The forest was a cathedral of ice and silence. Every surface glittered with frost that caught moonlight and turned the world into something beautiful and merciless. The temperature had dropped even further. Ember estimated 30 below, maybe worse in the wind-exposed areas they'd have to cross. At this temperature, exposed skin froze in minutes. Sweat became ice. Breathing required constant awareness to avoid frostbite in the lungs. The mountains were showing their teeth. Good. The cold made everyone slower, including their pursuers. Ember led them through a route that seemed to double back on itself, winding between terrain features that would have been invisible to anyone who didn't know what to look for. A dry streambed hidden under snow. A natural depression that provided dead ground from observation. A dense stand of pines that blocked thermal imaging, not that the Russians still had theirs. The SEALs followed in single file, Wilde and Dalton supporting Locke between them. The injured operator's breathing was labored, his fever getting worse despite the cold. Infection was winning its race against antibiotics. They needed real medical care soon. They'd been moving for 45 minutes when Ember held up her fist. Everyone froze. She pointed to tracks in the snow ahead, fresh, maybe 30 minutes old. A patrol had passed through heading east, 8 sets of prints, militia fighters based on the spacing and the way they'd moved. Ember studied the tracks, reading the story they told. These men were tired, cold, frustrated. Their spacing was sloppy. Their trails showed they'd stopped multiple times, clustering together to share body heat and probably complain. Not professional, not like the Russians had been. She led the team wide around the tracks, adding 10 minutes to their route but avoiding potential contact. In special operations, the best firefight was the one you never had. The terrain began to rise. Steeper slopes, deeper snow. Ember picked her path with exquisite care. The avalanche zone started here, though it wasn't obvious to untrained eyes. But she'd spent 17 years learning to read these mountains. She saw the signs, the particular texture of snow that indicated an unstable slab, the absence of trees that marked previous slide paths, the subtle convexity of the slope that concentrated stress. "From here," she whispered, her voice barely audible even to Thorn right behind her. Absolute silence, no radio, hand signals only, sound travels and triggers slides. Thorn passed the word back down the line without speaking. 9 operators acknowledged with simple nods. They moved into the danger zone. Every step was calculated. Ember tested the snow before committing weight. She chose the path that distributed their passage across the most stable areas. When they had to cross questionable ground, she sent them one at a time, spreading out to minimize the stress concentration. It took 45 agonizing minutes to cover 500 meters. Halfway across, Locke's foot broke through a weak layer. The small collapse sent a puff of snow cascading downhill. Tiny, insignificant. The mountain groaned. Everyone froze, literally not breathing as the snow settled. The sound faded. Nothing slid. The slope held. Locke's face was gray with pain and fear. Wild and Dalton gripped his arms tighter, taking more of his weight to prevent another breakthrough. They continued moving. Ember's heart was pounding hard enough she could feel it in her throat. This was beyond her training, beyond her father's lessons. This was just her and the mountain was weighing whether to kill them all or let them pass. She reached the far side of the danger zone and finally breathed normally. Turned back to see the seals completing their crossing one by one, shadows moving across the white slope like ghosts. They made it. All of them. Thorn came up beside her, his eyes showing respect that had nothing to do with rank or age. That was... He started to whisper. Ember pressed a finger to her lips. Not yet. Sound still carried here. She led them another 100 meters into the safety of the trees before stopping. "We're clear of the avalanche zone. The extraction point is just ahead." "How far?" 300 meters. Through those trees." She pointed to a gap in the forest where moonlight reflected off an open space beyond. "But we need to be sure the clearing is secure before we call for extraction." "I'll take point," Wild offered. "No." Ember shook her head. "They might have people watching it. Locals stand out less than military and tactical gear. I'll scout it. 5 minutes." Before Thorn could argue, she was moving. Low and quiet, using the trees for concealment, her white parka making her nearly invisible. The clearing was exactly as she remembered from previous expeditions with her father. Roughly circular, maybe 40 meters across, surrounded by tall pines. The snow was undisturbed except for animal tracks. No sign of human presence. But something felt wrong. Ember had learned to trust her instincts. The mountains taught you that ignoring the small voice that said danger was a good way to end up dead. She circled the clearing's perimeter, examining approaches, checking sight lines. There, in the trees on the far side, a position that offered perfect overwatch of the clearing, and in the snow below it barely visible in the moonlight disturbed areas where someone had scraped away snow to create a hide. The clearing was being watched. Ember eased back into the forest, moving even more carefully now. Returned to where the seals waited. "It's a trap," she whispered to Thorn. "Observation post on the north side. Probably more positions we can't see." Thorn's jaw tightened. They anticipated this. They know these mountains too. Not as well as me, but well enough to guess where we'd run. Ember pulled out her map, studying it by red-filtered light. "There's one more option. Further, more difficult, but definitely not compromised." "How much further?" 3 kilometers, but it's..." She hesitated. "It's bad terrain, real bad, and it puts us at the far edge of likely communications range." "What kind of bad?" "Ice falls, exposed traverse across a cliff face. If someone falls, we probably can't recover them." She met his eyes. "I can make it. I've done it before, but with Locke injured and everyone exhausted." "We've come this far on your guidance." Thorn cut her off. "It's gotten us through worse than we had any right to survive. If you say that's our best option, that's where we go." Dalton nodded agreement. So did the others, one by one. Ember felt something shift in her chest. Trust. These hardened warriors trusted her completely, not because of her age or despite it, just because she'd earned it. "Okay," she said, "but we need to move fast now. Once they realize we're not coming to this clearing, they'll start searching the other options, and there aren't many." She led them away from the compromised extraction point, angling northeast toward terrain that got progressively more vertical and hostile. Behind them, the forest was silent except for wind through the pines. But Ember knew the silence wouldn't last. The hunters were out there searching, and sooner or later they'd find the trail. Then the race would be on. They climbed through darkness and cold, following a girl who'd lost everything but refused to let that stop her from saving the men who might finally make her family's massacre matter to the world. And somewhere in the frozen night, radios crackled with militia voices organizing a final push to kill the Americans and the ghost girl who'd humiliated them. The endgame was beginning. The ice field appeared like a vision from a frozen hell. What had once been a waterfall in warmer months was now a vertical cascade of blue-white ice. 200 feet of crystallized water clinging to the cliff face at angles that seemed to defy physics. Moonlight turned it into something beautiful and absolutely lethal. Ember stood at its base, studying the route with eyes that had memorized this climb 6 months ago when her father had insisted they practice every possible escape route from the commune. He'd made her climb it 3 times, once in daylight, once at dusk, once in full darkness with only starlight to guide her. She'd complained then, thought he was being paranoid, excessive. Now she understood he'd been trying to keep her alive for exactly this moment. "You want us to climb that?" Dalton said quietly, his voice carrying no judgment. Just statement of fact. "There's a route. Not obvious, but it's there. The ice is solid, hasn't been warm enough to weaken it." Ember pointed to features only she could see. "You traverse right for about 30 feet, then straight up using those frozen columns for purchase. Another traverse left at the midpoint. Final push straight up to the ledge." "With Locke unable to use one leg and all of us exhausted," Thorne observed. "Yes." Ember turned to face them. "I won't lie. This is dangerous. But the alternative is being hunted through open terrain where they have numbers and heavy weapons. Up there," she pointed to the top of the ice fall, "there's a saddle between 2 peaks, protected from the wind. Good radio line of sight, and only one approach which we can defend." Thorne studied the cliff face, his expression unreadable. He'd led men through terrible places before, made calls that risked lives to save missions, but this was beyond anything in the SEAL training manual. "Can you get Locke up there?" he asked Kavanaugh. The medic examined the ice fall, calculating angles and possibilities. "If we rig a hauling system, maybe. Use our climbing rope as a prusik. But it'll be slow, exposed, if they find us while we're on that face." "We'll be fish in a barrel," Wild finished. "Can't fight from a vertical position." Ember listened to them discuss the tactical problem, these professionals weighing odds and calculating acceptable risk. She understood their hesitation. Everything in their training told them this was a bad idea. Tactical doctrine said never put yourself in a position where retreat was impossible, but tactical doctrine assumed you had good options to choose from. "They're coming," she said quietly, all eyes turned to her. "I can feel it. The way the forest sounds, the way the wind carries, they're close now, maybe 30 minutes behind us." "How can you know that?" Stryker asked. "Because these mountains raised me. I know when something's wrong the way you know when you're being watched through a rifle scope." She met each of their eyes in turn. "We can try to run further, but we're leaving a trail they can follow. Or we can climb to ground that's defensible and hope communications work from up there. Those are our options." The silence stretched for 10 seconds that felt like 10 hours. "We climb," Thorne decided. "Ember, you lead. Show us the route." She nodded and approached the ice, her crampons biting into the frozen surface with a sound like breaking glass. The metal points her father had insisted she carry in her pack always be prepared for ISEM now meant the difference between climbing and dying. The first section was nearly vertical. Ember moved with the fluid confidence of someone who'd done this before, her ice axes finding purchase in frozen columns, her feet kicking steps into the harder sections. She climbed 15 feet set, a screw anchor clipped her rope through it, and continued. Behind her, the SEALs prepared to follow. They had limited climbing gear. This hadn't been a mountaineering mission. But SEALs trained for every environment. They knew the basics, even if none of them had Ember's intimate knowledge of this specific terrain. Wild came next, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who knew one mistake would be his last. Then Merrick. Then Dalton. Each man climbing with professional focus, their tactical gear making them less agile, but their training making them adaptable. The real challenge was Locke. They'd rigged a harness from web gear and climbing rope, attached it to a pulley system that let two men haul while one climbed alongside to guide him past obstacles. It was improvised and dangerous and absolutely necessary. Kavanaugh and Saunders took the hauling duty. Morrison climbed beside Locke, using his body to shield the injured man from the worst bumps and helping position his good leg when it was needed. Ember reached the first traverse point and set another anchor. The ledge was barely 6 inches wide, covered in verglas, the thin, invisible ice that made even experienced climbers slip. She chipped it away with her axe, creating better purchase, then called down. "Traverse point, very slick, take it slow." The climb took 90 minutes. 90 minutes of exposure on a cliff face that offered no protection, no cover, no escape if someone started shooting from below. 90 minutes of fighting cold that was trying to freeze muscles and make fingers too stiff to grip properly. 90 minutes of Locke's barely suppressed groans as the harness dug into his fever-racked body and every movement jarred his infected leg. But they made it. Ember pulled herself over the final lip and onto the saddle. The wind was less fierce here, blocked by the peaks on either side. The snow was deep but stable, and most importantly, the position offered commanding views of the approaches. She helped pull Locke up the final few feet, then collapsed against a boulder, her arms shaking with exhaustion. She'd climbed carrying full gear and her rifle, had set most of the protection points, had guided each man past the worst obstacles. Now she paid the price. Her muscles were screaming, her hands were cramping. The cold had worked its way deep into her core despite the exertion. Thorne appeared beside her, pressing a water bottle into her hands. "Drink." She drank. The water was cold enough to hurt her teeth, but her body desperately needed hydration. "You did it," Thorne said. "Got us somewhere defensible. That was—" He paused, searching for words. "That was the most impressive piece of mountain craft I've ever seen." Ember didn't respond. She was too tired for words, too numb for pride. She'd just done what needed doing, what her father had trained her to do. Survive. Keep moving. Never give up. Stryker was working his radio, trying every frequency. His face lit up suddenly. "Sir, I've got a carrier tone. Jamming's not reaching us up here." "Make the call," Thorne ordered. Stryker keyed the handset, his voice professional despite the exhaustion they all felt. Overwatch 1, this is Ghost 7, how copy?" Static hissed. Then a voice broke through, distant but clear. "Ghost 7, this is Overwatch 1, read you Lima Charlie, we've been trying to reach you for 18 hours, what is your status?" "Overwatch 1, we are operational but degraded, 1 casualty requiring immediate medical evacuation, current position." Stryker read off the GPS coordinates from his unit. "Be advised, hot LZ, hostile forces in area, we need extract ASAP." "Ghost 7, roger all. Birds are spinning up now, ETA 45 minutes, can you hold position?" Stryker looked at Thorne. Thorne looked at Ember. She studied the terrain below the icefall. They'd climbed the forest beyond it, the multiple approach routes an enemy could use. "We can hold," she said. "The ice climb is too technical for a quick assault. They'll have to come up the long way through that saddle to the east. Gives us 20 minutes warning minimum." Thorne keyed the radio himself. "Overwatch 1, affirmative. We can hold for 45 minutes. Be advised, we have civilian on site who assisted our evasion. 17-year-old female local knowledge operator. She requires extract as well." A pause on the other end. Then, Ghost 7 confirmed civilian extract authorized. Overwatch 1 confirmed and required. This individual saved our entire team and possesses critical intelligence on domestic terrorist operation. She is not optional cargo. Roger, Ghost 7. Civilian extract approved. See you in 45. Ember felt something loosen in her chest. Extract approved. They were actually going to get out. She was actually going to survive this. The realization hit her harder than she expected. For 6 days she'd been operating on pure momentum, never thinking past the next hour, the next decision, the next impossible thing that needed doing. Now suddenly there was a future. A time after the mountains, after the killing, after the survival. She didn't know what to do with that information. We need to prepare the position, Thorne was saying, pulling her back to present. Ember, you know the terrain. What's our best defensive layout? She forced herself to focus, pushed away the exhaustion and the emotion and the overwhelming weight of everything that had happened later. She could deal with all of it later. Right now, she had a job to finish. She studied the saddle with tactical eyes, seeing it the way her father had taught her to see terrain. Natural strong points, fields of fire, dead ground where attackers could hide. Choke points that could be controlled with minimum force. They'll come through that saddle. She pointed east. It's the only approach that doesn't require technical climbing. We set up here behind these rocks. Gives us cover and overlooks the approach. One person on overwatch here. She indicated a higher boulder with comms and rifle. Everyone else ready to move to the helicopter when it arrives. Time from first contact to extract, Thorne asked. If they push hard, maybe 10 minutes. If they're cautious, longer. Depends how badly they want us dead. Wild climbed to the overwatch position, settling in with his rifle. I've got the high ground. Anyone comes through that saddle, they're in my engagement area. The team established defensive positions with the automatic efficiency of professionals who'd done this 1,000 times. Ammunition redistributed to ensure everyone had enough for a firefight. Locke positioned where he could shoot if needed, but was protected by the best cover. Medical supplies staged for quick access. Ember found herself with nothing to do. Her role as guide was complete. The SEALs knew their business now. She was just a passenger waiting for a ride. The exhaustion hit her like a physical weight, 6 days of constant movement and stress. Minimal food and water, almost no sleep. Her body was shutting down, demanding rest. She'd denied it for too long. She sat with her back against a rock, her rifle across her lap, and closed her eyes just for a moment. When she opened them again, Kavanaugh was shaking her shoulder gently. Ember, wake up. She jerked awake, reaching for her rifle. What's happening? Easy. You've been asleep for 20 minutes. Wild spotted movement below. They found us. The adrenaline surge burned away the fog of sleep. Ember moved to a position where she could see the approach. In the growing dawn light, when had it become dawn, she spotted figures moving through the forest below. At least 20, maybe more. Militia fighters based on their movement pattern, but behind them, maintaining better spacing and discipline, came others, the remaining Russians. 40 minutes, Thorne said, checking his watch. We need to hold for 40 minutes. They'll try to rush us, Dalton observed, overwhelmed with numbers before the helicopter arrives. Let them try, Wild called from his perch. That saddle is a fatal funnel. I can control it solo if I have to. The militia reached the base of the ice fall and stopped. Ember could imagine their confusion. The Americans had climbed that impossible. Then the Russians arrived and the confusion ended. Orders were shouted. The militia began spreading out, searching for another route. The Russians studied the ice fall with professional assessment, then started organizing a climbing team. They're going to try the ice, Ember said. The Russians. They have enough skill to make it work. How long? Thorne asked. With proper gear and experience, 20 minutes to the top. Maybe less if they push hard. Thorne did the math. That puts them up here before the helicopter arrives. Yes. Can we stop them on the climb, shoot them while they're exposed? Ember shook her head. They'll send the militia up first. Use them as shields while the professionals set up fire positions to cover the climb. If we engage, we expose our position and burn ammunition we might need for the final defense. What do you recommend? Ember studied the tactical situation with eyes that were equal parts 17-year-old girl and mountain warrior forged in a crucible of survival. The answer was obvious but terrible. Let them climb. Let them get close. Then hit them hard when they reach the top and they're most vulnerable. Transitioning from vertical to horizontal movement, that's when they're weakest. Thorn nodded slowly. You think like an operator. I think like my father. He taught me how to set ambushes for elk. Same principles apply to people. Her voice was flat, empty of emotion. Kill zone is kill zone. Doesn't matter if the target walks on 4 legs or 2. The militia began their climb. They were terrible at it, flailing, slipping, making noise that echoed off the rocks. Several fell tumbling down to land in snow with bone-breaking impacts. The others kept climbing, driven by orders and fear and whatever motivated men to follow evil commanders. The Russians waited, watching, learning from the militia's mistakes. Patient and professional. 20 minutes crawled past with agonizing slowness. The militia fighters reached the midpoint traverse, the same section where Ember had warned the SEALs about Verglas. 3 men slipped and fell, their screams cutting off abruptly when they hit bottom. The others kept climbing. Thorn checked his watch. 20 minutes to extract. They'll make the top in 10, Ember said. We're going to have to fight. Conserve ammunition. Aimed fire only. We don't need to kill them all. Just hold them back until the bird arrives. The first militia fighter's head appeared over the lip of the cliff. He pulled himself up, gasping, triumphant at having survived the climb. Wild's rifle cracked once. The man pitched backward, falling the entire 200 feet to the bottom. The ambush was sprung. Chaos erupted. Militia fighters on the cliff face tried to climb faster, making themselves easier targets. Others tried to climb down, creating a logjam of bodies on the ice. The Russians below opened fire, their rounds snapping over the saddle, but unable to achieve the angles needed to effectively suppress the SEAL's position. Ember settled into a shooter's position, her L-96 familiar in her hands. 2 militia fighters reached the top together. She fired twice. Both dropped. Reload. Breathe. Scan for next target. Another fighter appeared. Merrick engaged him. Clean shot, instant kill. The militia broke. They couldn't take the casualties. Men started retreating down the icefall, desperate to escape the kill zone. Several fell during the panicked descent. Others simply stopped climbing, clinging to the ice face, neither ascending nor descending, frozen by fear. But the Russians kept coming. They climbed with professional competence, using the militia's bodies, living and dead, as cover. They moved fast, accepting the risk, understanding that hesitation on a cliff face was death just as surely as a bullet. A Russian operator reached the top first. He pulled himself up, rolled, came up with his rifle already firing. His rounds forced Dalton to duck behind cover. The Russian dove behind a boulder, established a defensive position, and began laying down covering fire for others to follow. More Russians appeared. 1, 2, 3. Each man a professional, each one understanding his role in the assault. They were establishing a foothold, creating space for more to climb up. Suppress that position, Thorn ordered. Multiple rifles opened up, forcing the Russians to keep their heads down. But it was a delaying action, not a solution. More Russians were climbing. In 5 minutes, maybe less, they'd have enough force up here to push the SEALs off this position. Ember engaged the closest Russian, her shot forcing him to abandon his attempt to flank around the right side. She fired again at another target. The L-96 was running low on ammunition. She had maybe 10 rounds left. Thorn was on the radio. Overwatch 1, Ghost 7. We are in heavy contact. Request immediate extract. LZ is hot. I say again, LZ is hot. Ghost 7 birds are inbound. 3 minutes. Hang tight. 3 minutes. 180 seconds, an eternity in combat. The Russians made their push. 6 men moved as a coordinated team, laying down fire and maneuvering. Professional infantry tactics executed with precision. They were trying to flank the SEAL position from 2 sides simultaneously. Fall back to secondary position, Thorne ordered. The team bounded backward, maintaining fire discipline, covering each other's movement. They were being compressed into a smaller and smaller area. Soon they'd have nowhere left to retreat. Then Ember heard it, the most beautiful sound in the world. Helicopter rotors, getting louder. 2 Blackhawks appeared over the ridgeline, flying low and fast. The door gunners opened up immediately, their M134 miniguns spooling up with that distinctive roar that sounded like the world's angriest chainsaw. 3,000 rounds per minute of 7.62mm hate poured down on the Russian positions. Rock and ice exploded. Men dove for cover or died trying. The Russian assault disintegrated under the overwhelming firepower. The first Blackhawk touched down in the saddle, its rotors never stopping. The crew chief waved frantically. "Go, go, go!" Thorne shouted. Kavanaugh and Saunders carried Locke between them, running in a crouch toward the helicopter. The rest of the team followed, maintaining rear security, still firing at any Russian who tried to engage. Ember ran her legs, moving on autopilot, her body so far past exhaustion it had stopped registering pain. She was 10 meters from the helicopter when she saw movement from the corner of her eye. A Russian fighter, injured but determined, raising his rifle, aiming not at the SEALs but at the helicopter's tail rotor. A good shot there would bring the bird down, kill everyone aboard. Ember's body moved before her mind processed the decision. She threw herself sideways, bringing her rifle up mid-dive, fired from an impossible position at an impossible target. The Russian's head snapped back. He fell. Ember's 11th kill. Strong hands grabbed her, hauled her to her feet. Wild and Merrick, one on each side, literally carrying her the last few meters to the helicopter. She tumbled inside. The crew chief was already lifting Locke into the bird. The other SEALs piled in weapons, still trained outward, still ready to fight. "Everyone aboard!" the pilot shouted. "All accounted for," Thorne confirmed. The Black Hawk lifted off its door gunners, continuing to suppress the Russian position. The second bird provided cover, circling with its own guns ready. They climbed rapidly, the saddle falling away below. Ember saw the Russians regrouping, pointing upward, impotent fury visible even from this altitude. She'd won, survived, gotten the Americans out alive. The mission was complete. She slumped against the helicopter's bulkhead, letting the rifle fall from numb fingers. Kavanaugh was working on Locke, starting IVs, calling for medical support over the radio. The other SEALs were checking weapons, going through post-combat procedures automatically. Thorne moved to sit beside Ember, pressed a water bottle into her hands. She drank mechanically. "You saved my entire team," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the rotor noise. "Multiple times. That's not something I can ever repay." Ember didn't respond. She was watching the mountains fall away below. These peaks that had been her entire world, where she'd been born, learned to walk, learned to hunt, learned to survive. Where her family had lived and died, where 43 people had been murdered for the crime of wanting to live free. For the first time since the massacre, tears came. Silent and steady, they ran down her face, cutting tracks through 6 days of accumulated dirt and exhaustion. She was leaving, actually leaving. The mountains that had raised her, that had protected her, that had very nearly killed her. She was leaving them behind, leaving her father buried in the ruins of their home, leaving the commune graves, leaving everything she'd ever known. Thorne didn't try to stop her crying, didn't offer empty platitudes. He just sat beside her, a solid presence, letting her know she wasn't alone. The flight took 40 minutes, the longest and shortest 40 minutes of Ember's life. Long enough for the adrenaline to completely crash, short enough that she couldn't process everything that had happened. She drifted in and out of awareness, noticed at some point that someone had wrapped her in a thermal blanket, that Kavanaugh had checked her over for injuries, treating cuts and minor frostbite on her fingers, that the helicopter was descending toward lights and buildings and civilization. Fort Lewis, Washington, a proper military base with proper facilities. Safety. The concept felt alien. The Black Hawk touched down on a brightly lit pad. Medical personnel rushed forward with a stretcher for Locke. Military police established a security perimeter. Officers waited to debrief the returning operators. Ember let herself be helped out of the helicopter, her legs barely supporting her weight. The ground felt strange after so many days on mountain terrain. Flat, stable, wrong. A woman in an army uniform approached. Colonel's eagles on her shoulders, her bearing suggesting someone who'd spent decades in command. She spoke briefly with Thorne, then approached Ember. "Miss Blackwood, I'm Colonel Sarah Martinez, base commander. Welcome to Fort Lewis. You're safe now." Safe. The word meant nothing. Everything. Too much to process. "My family," Ember heard herself say. "Someone needs to... the bodies. They need to be..." "We know," Colonel Martinez said gently. "Lieutenant Thorne briefed us during the flight. We're organizing a recovery team now. They'll treat your people with the respect and dignity they deserve. I promise you that." Ember nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "Right now, let's get you to medical. Get you checked out, fed, cleaned up. Then we'll need to talk about what happened. But that can wait until you've had some rest." They guided her to a medical facility. Clean and warm and impossibly bright after days in the forest. Doctors examined her with professional efficiency. Malnutrition, dehydration, exhaustion, minor frostbite, various cuts and bruises. Nothing life-threatening, nothing that wouldn't heal. But they couldn't examine the wounds that mattered. Couldn't fix what had broken inside her during 6 days of running and killing and surviving while everyone she loved stayed dead. They gave her clean clothes that smelled like detergent and felt strange against skin that had worn the same gear for a week. Fed her bland military food that tasted like chemicals. Tried to get her to sleep in a clean bed with white sheets. She lay there staring at the ceiling, unable to close her eyes without seeing faces. Her father's face in the moment before he died. Mrs. Hendricks holding little Sarah as the flames rose. Sokolov's expression when he realized the mine was collapsing. 43 dead in the commune. 4 militia fighters in the initial ambush. Sokolov in the mine. Others during the climbing assault. How many total she'd lost count, stopped caring about the numbers. All that mattered was that none of those deaths brought her family back. Someone knocked on the door. Thorne entered carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you might be awake," he said. "Can't sleep. I know the feeling." He handed her 1 cup, sat in the chair beside her bed. "After my first real combat, I couldn't sleep for 3 days. Kept seeing it all every time I closed my eyes." Ember wrapped her hands around the coffee cup, letting the warmth seep into her cold fingers. "Does it get better?" "Eventually. With time and help and processing." He paused. "But it never goes completely away. You learn to live with it, to carry it without letting it destroy you." "I killed people," Ember said quietly. 11 of them. I counted. You defended yourself and others. There's a difference." "Is there?" "They're just as dead either way." Thorne sipped his coffee, choosing his words carefully. "I can't tell you how to feel about what you did. That's something you'll have to work through on your own. But I can tell you this. You did what you had to do to survive. Your father told you to survive. You honored his last wish. He told me to survive. He didn't tell me I'd have to kill people to do it. He was a ranger. 3 combat tours. He knew what survival sometimes costs." Thorne met her eyes. "He prepared you as best he could, gave you the skills and training you needed. That's not coincidence. He was preparing you for the worst-case scenario." "I wish he'd prepared himself better," Ember said bitterly. "Wish he'd..." She stopped. Couldn't finish the sentence. Couldn't say the words that had been eating at her for 6 days. Thorne waited patient. "I should have been there," Ember whispered. "I was 8 kilometers away hunting. If I'd been home, maybe I could have..." "You'd be dead," Thorne interrupted firmly. "That's all. Nothing else would have changed except you'd be buried with the others. At least we'd be together. And 43 murders would have gone unanswered. The Scorpion militia would still be operating freely. The Russians would still be training domestic terrorists. 9 Navy SEALs would be dead in those mountains." Thorne leaned forward. "Your survival matters, Ember. It matters because you're the only one who can tell the world what happened. You're the witness, the evidence, the proof that evil was done and needs to be answered for." Ember wanted to believe him, wanted to find meaning in the survival that felt like betrayal. But the guilt was overwhelming, drowning out everything else. "I spoke with Colonel Martinez," Thorne continued. "The Army wants to help you, get you set up somewhere safe. Education, counseling, whatever you need. I need my family back." "I know, but since that's not possible," he paused, gathering himself. "My wife and we've talked. Our daughter is 8. Always wanted a big sister. If you're willing, if you want, we'd be honored to have you stay with us. Not trying to replace your family, just offering a place to land while you figure out what comes next." Ember stared at him. The offer was so unexpected, so generous that she couldn't process it immediately. "Why?" she finally asked. "You don't know me. I know you saved my life. I know you're brave and smart and capable beyond your years. I know you deserve better than what those mountains gave you, and I know you shouldn't have to face what comes next alone. I don't know how to be normal, how to be a regular teenager. Then don't be. Be yourself. Just be safe while doing it. Let us help you heal. That's all we're asking." Ember felt something crack inside her chest. The armor she'd been wearing for 6 days, the emotional distance that had kept her functional, started to crumble. Behind it was an ocean of grief and exhaustion and desperate need for someone to tell her she'd be okay. "I'd like that," she whispered. "Not right away. I need to. There are things I need to do first, but after. Maybe after." Thorne nodded. "After is fine. Take whatever time you need." He placed the coffee cup on the side table. "Get some rest. Tomorrow starts the debriefings. FBI, Homeland Security, the whole alphabet soup. They'll want everything you know about the Scorpion militia and the Russians." "Good," Ember said quietly. "I want them hunted down. All of them. They will be. I promise you that." Thorne moved toward the door, then paused. "One more thing. You're not alone in this. Remember that." After he left, Ember sat in the darkness holding the cooling coffee. For the first time in 6 days, she felt something other than hollow rage or numbing fear. She felt the faint stirring of something that might eventually become hope. She still couldn't sleep, but maybe that was okay. Maybe healing didn't start with rest. Maybe it started with knowing you'd survived for a reason. The next 3 days passed in a blur of debriefings and medical checks and paperwork. Ember told her story again and again to various officials. Military intelligence, FBI, Department of Homeland Security. Everyone wanted to know about the Scorpion militia, the Russian contractors, the commune massacre. She answered their questions mechanically, her voice flat and emotionless. Showed them her photographs, her maps, her surveillance notes, provided detailed information on weapons, tactics, positions, gave them everything they needed to hunt down the people responsible. On the 4th day, Colonel Martinez found her in the medical facility's common area, staring out a window at mountains that were the wrong mountains. Too gentle, too tame, not home. "Miss Blackwood, we're ready. The recovery team is assembled. If you're willing, we'd like you to come with us. To your commune, to help identify the victims." Ember's throat tightened. She'd known this was coming, had been dreading it, but it needed to be done. Her family deserved proper burials, deserved to be remembered as people, not just statistics. "Okay," she said. "I'll come." The convoy rolled out an hour later. Military vehicles, forensic teams, state police, FBI agents, a full investigative force descending on the Bitterroot Mountains to document what had been done there. Thorne came too. He didn't ask permission, just appeared beside her in the helicopter. A quiet presence that made the impossible slightly less overwhelming. The flight took 90 minutes. Ember watched the terrain change from the tame mountains near Fort Lewis to the wilder peaks of Montana. Getting closer to home, to the place where everything had ended, the helicopter set down in a clearing 2 kilometers from the commune. The last part had to be done on foot. The terrain was too rough for vehicles. Ember led them through forest she knew better than her own face. Every tree, every rock, every turn in the trail held memories. Here was where she'd learned to track deer with her father. There was the stream where she'd spent summer afternoons catching trout with the other commune kids. All of it empty now, silent except for wind through the pines and the crunch of boots on snow. The commune appeared through the trees like a wound in the forest. Blackened buildings, scattered debris, the absolute stillness of a place where life had been violently extinguished. Ember stopped at the perimeter, her breath catching in her chest. She'd seen it before through her rifle scope from 8 kilometers away. But being here standing in the ruins was different, worse, more real. Thorne's hand touched her shoulder briefly, not constraining, just offering support if she needed it. She stepped forward. The forensic teams went to work immediately documenting everything. Photographs, measurements, evidence collection. Professional and respectful, treating the site like the crime scene it was. Ember walked through the ruins, her memories overlaying the destruction. That pile of charred wood had been the Hendricks' home. Those metal bed frames marked where the Johnsons had lived. The collapsed structure in the center had been the community hall. They'd found her father's body where he'd made his last stand, 3 militia fighters dead around him. The forensic team handled him with careful respect, understanding without being told that this was the girl's father. Ember knelt beside his body, what remained of it. The cold had preserved it better than summer would have. She could still see his face frozen in an expression of determined fury. "You taught me well, Dad," she whispered. "Everything you said I'd need. You were right." She stood, forcing herself to be professional, to be the expert they needed her to be. She identified each body, reciting names and ages from memory. Sarah Hendricks, age 6. Thomas Wu, age 52. Maria Gonzalez, age 34. 43 names. 43 people who'd chosen to live free and paid for that choice with their lives. The forensic team worked through the day, documenting everything. Evidence of the massacre was overwhelming. Shell casings, bullet impacts, fire accelerant residue. This hadn't been a firefight, it had been an execution. FBI agent Harrison, lead investigator, approached Ember as afternoon waned toward evening. "We have enough for warrants. Multiple counts of first-degree murder, domestic terrorism, interstate criminal conspiracy. The people who did this will face justice." "Some of them are already dead," Ember said. "Sokolov, the ones I killed during the rescue. The ones who survive will stand trial, I promise you that." Agent Harrison's face was grim. "This is the worst domestic terror incident in Montana history. The Bureau is making it top priority." Ember nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Justice. The word felt hollow. Trials and prison sentences wouldn't bring anyone back, wouldn't undo what had been done, but it was something. A recognition that what happened here mattered, that these lives meant something beyond the violence of their ending. Colonel Martinez organized a temporary burial detail. The bodies would be taken to the state medical examiner for formal processing, but they wanted to mark the site. To ensure it was treated as hallowed ground, they erected a simple marker, wood carved with 43 names. Nothing fancy, nothing permanent, but enough to show that people had lived here, had died here, would be remembered. Ember stood in front of the marker as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the snow orange and gold. Behind her, the investigation team was packing up. Tomorrow they'd return with more resources, more personnel. Begin the long process of justice. But for tonight, this moment, it was just her and the marker and the mountains that had raised her. "I'm leaving," she told the marker. Told the names, told her father. "Going somewhere safe, going to heal if I can, going to build something from what you left me." The wind sighed through the pines. "But I'll come back, when they put up a proper memorial, when there's something permanent to show you were here, that you mattered." She stepped forward, touched her father's name carved in the wood. "Thank you, Dad, for everything, for teaching me, for loving me, for giving me the skills to survive when survival meant everything." Her voice broke. "I hope I made you proud." Thorne appeared beside her. "He is proud. I never met him, but I know he is." They stood in silence as darkness fell and the first stars appeared. Finally, Ember turned away, toward the helicopter, toward whatever came next. The flight back to Fort Lewis was quiet. Ember dozed fitfully, her body finally demanding rest it had been denied for over a week. When she woke, they were landing. The next 6 months passed in a blur of motion and stasis simultaneously. The Army processed her paperwork. She had nowhere else to go, no living relatives to claim her. Made her a ward of military services temporarily. Assigned her counselors and caseworkers and support staff. Thorne and his wife Emily welcomed her into their Virginia Beach home with a guest room and no pressure. Their daughter Mackenzie, 8 years old and full of boundless energy, immediately decided Ember was the best thing that had ever happened to their family. "You're like a superhero," Mackenzie said the first night, eyes wide. "Daddy said you saved his whole team." "I'm not a superhero," Ember replied. "I'm just someone who survived. That's what makes you super." School was harder than combat had been. Ember, enrolled in the local high school, suddenly expected to care about homework and tests and social dynamics that felt utterly meaningless after what she'd experienced. Her classmates complained about pop quizzes. She'd killed 11 people. They worried about prom dates. She had nightmares about burning buildings. They took safety for granted. She couldn't stop checking exits and sight lines. The disconnect was overwhelming. But she tried. Attended classes, did the assignments, sat through lectures about history she'd lived through firsthand. When you counted her father's and grandfather's experiences as extensions of her own knowledge. The counseling helped more than she'd expected. Dr. Sarah Mendoza was a VA specialist who'd worked with combat veterans for 20 years. She didn't flinch when Ember described what she'd done, didn't judge, just listened and helped her process. "Survivor's guilt is common," Dr. Mendoza explained during one session. "You feel like you should have died with your family, like surviving makes you somehow responsible for their deaths. I was 8 kilometers away hunting," Ember said. "If I'd been home, you'd be dead, that's all. Your presence wouldn't have changed the outcome. 40 militiamen with automatic weapons against one teenage girl, the math is simple." "But I could have tried, and died accomplishing nothing. Instead, you survived. You tracked them. You helped Navy SEALs escape. You provided evidence that led to arrests and trials. You gave your family's deaths meaning by ensuring justice was served." Ember wanted to argue but couldn't find the words. Maybe because Dr. Mendoza was right. Maybe because accepting that truth meant accepting she'd made the right choice even if it felt wrong. The legal proceedings ground forward with bureaucratic slowness. 12 Scorpion militia members were arrested. Wade Brennan, their leader, was charged with 43 counts of first-degree murder plus terrorism enhancements. The trial was set for the following year. Ember would have to testify. Relive everything again in front of cameras and journalists and a defendant who'd helped murder her family. She dreaded it, needed it, couldn't wait for it to be over. 6 months after the rescue, Thorne drove her back to Montana. A monument had been erected at the commune site. Proper stone professionally carved. 43 names listed with dates of birth and death. A plaque explaining what had happened here. In memory of the Bitterroot commune, 43 souls who lived free and died defending their right to that freedom. May they never be forgotten. A ceremony was held. Governor of Montana attended. Senator made a speech. FBI director said words about justice and remembrance. Ember barely heard any of it. She stood in front of her father's name, Jacob Blackwood, 1975-2025, and told him silently about the life she was building. About school and counseling and learning to sleep through the night without nightmares. About Mackenzie's endless questions and Emily's patient kindness and Thorne's steady presence. About the veterans support group she'd started volunteering at, helping soldiers process trauma. About the other survivors who understood without needing explanation. About still carrying his lessons, still honoring his memory, still being the person he'd raised her to be. The crowd dispersed eventually. Thorne gave her space, standing back by the vehicles while she had her moment. Ember placed a hand on the stone, feeling the carved letters under her palm. I'm okay, Dad, she whispered. Not great, not healed, but okay. And that's a start. She turned away toward Thorn and the vehicles and the life that was waiting, toward tomorrow and all the tomorrows after that. The mountains watched her go silent and eternal, keeping their dead and their secrets. But Ember Blackwood was no longer one of those secrets. She'd emerged from those peaks carrying testimony and truth, had refused to let 43 murders be buried in snow and slents. She'd survived. More than survived, she'd ensured that her family's sacrifice meant something, that their stand for freedom was remembered, that justice slow and imperfect had been served. It wasn't enough, would never be enough, but it was something. And sometimes in a world full of loss and violence and senseless cruelty, something was all you could hope for. She climbed into Thorn's truck, buckled her seatbelt, and let him drive her away from the mountains for the second time. But this time felt different, not an escape, a departure. She'd come back someday, when the trials were over, when more time had passed, when she could look at these peaks without seeing flames. But for now, she was going home, to Virginia Beach and salt air and a family that hadn't asked to take in a traumatized teenage girl but had opened their doors anyway, to school and counseling and the slow work of healing, to a future that her father had died ensuring she'd have. She owed it to him to make it a good one. The mountains receded in the side mirror, getting smaller, fading into distance and memory. But they'd always be part of her, the place that made her, the crucible that forged her into something harder and stronger than any 17-year-old should have to be. They called her a kid and laughed, until the moment she showed them what Montana mountains teach those who survive them. That age is just a number, that courage comes in unexpected forms, that sometimes the most unlikely people are exactly who you need when the world goes dark. Ember Blackwood closed her eyes and let the motion of the truck lull her towards something almost like peace. The story was over. The living was just beginning.